Hello, everyone, and welcome to Produce Talks, the podcast brought to you by the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. I'm your host, Jen Ongtone, Manager of Health and Education at CPMA. Throughout this podcast, we sit down with industry experts and leaders from across the produce supply chain to explore the latest trends, challenges, and opportunities shaping our industry. Let's get started.
So welcome to CPMA's Produce Talks. My name is Dan Duguay, CPMA's Senior Director of Sustainability, and I'll be your host today. Today's episode is brought to you by our series sponsor, Crawford Packaging, a leading supplier of fresh produce packaging solutions. As part of Fall 2025 Sustainability Series, today we are speaking, it so happens, about packaging, and to be more precise, sustainable produce packaging. If there's a topic that has dominated the sustainability conversation within the fresh produce industry over the past several years, it's packaging, and what the industry can do to reduce packaging waste after it served its function of getting fresh produce from the field to the fork, as we like to say. However, this conversation is evolving and becoming increasingly complex. Although minimizing packaging waste remains an important outcome consumers are looking for, it arguably should not come at the cost of increasing food waste, reducing shelf life, or adversely impacting the effectiveness and the efficiency of supply chains. And this challenge is further complicated by the industry's reliance on a broad portfolio of packaging solutions that enable both business-to-business as well as business-to-consumer movement of numerous fresh produce commodities Canadians have come to expect year-round. So to help us unpack this very important challenge, pun intended, I'd like to welcome our guest today. Stuart Jackson, VP of Produce Packaging at Crawford Packaging, based in London, Ontario, Canada, a leading provider of produce primary packaging. JF Delorme, Director of Retail Sales at IFCO, based in Ottawa, Canada, a global leader in secondary and tertiary packaging, the business-to-business packaging, so critical to getting bulk as well as packaged produce from the farm to their retail environment. And Jeff Brandenburg, founder, QFresh Lab, a leading packaging consultancy, based in Greenfield, Massachusetts, who brings many decades of experience in helping clients design, modify, and even optimize their packaging to enable the most sustainable produce supply chains possible. So to kick us off today, let's start with defining what sustainable packaging is. We hear the term used so frequently, it might imply that it's well understood across the industry, but let's confirm that. So first question will be, given it implies a balancing of environmental, economic, and social considerations, I'd like to ask our participants today to share how they define or describe sustainable packaging, or maybe even more specifically, sustainable produce packaging. Stuart, let's start with you, given you're sort of at the coalface of this on the primary packaging side. How do you define it?
I think, Dan, first off, thanks for inviting us on. It's a great honor to be here with Jeff and JF. I believe that on the sustainable side of it, it is using materials that are either recycled, compostable, looking at different avenues to right-size different packaging to meet the requirement of the produce in itself. It has to have a direct sustainable impact. In other words, whether or not we're helping with prevention of food loss, if we're helping with reduction in materials. So there's some different aspects to it for sure.
That's cool. JF, you see this from the perspective of B2B, which is obviously quite different. Consumers often don't even see what you guys do in this whole equation. How do you describe or speak to sustainable packaging as an objective?
From when we're talking about a B2B packaging, a B2B sustainable packaging, Dan, my view is basically it is whatever needs to bring the fruit of the farmer's labor, the produce itself, to market, and maintain as much of that original quality, freshness, integrity as the day was picked. So whether when you're talking secondary, tertiary, we're talking pallet, we're talking corner boards, we're talking shrink wrap, we're talking actually master case, master container. And it's important for that master case to be able to conserve all the attributes that we come to know and love of produce once it gets delivered to the retail store for our consumers to pick it up. I would add that most importantly, the end of that usefulness doesn't stop once the product is taken out of that shell, that box, or that RPC, or that taken off the pallet. We need to remove that packaging or handle that packaging in a manner that doesn't, just fill up our landfill either, right? So if a sustainability piece, you're talking two different things. You're talking, one is protection of produce during the transit, as well as, end of life cycle.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff. Jeff, I think a good segue, understanding what you've been involved in a lot of these discussions regarding probably a myriad of commodities over your many decades. How do you speak to sustainable produce packaging these days?
Yeah, and again, thank you so much. It's an honor and privilege to be here speaking with everyone. I think the challenge with sustainable packaging, and my definition is very similar to Stuart's and JF's, and it looks at the entire supply chain, not just end of life. I think the challenge is that there are so many definitions out there, and even more importantly, people don't really know what the definition is. So, you get experts like ourselves, and yes, it's the end of life strategy without compromising functionality, food waste, greenhouse gases, all of that. But I think the challenge is most people don't think about sustainable packaging that way. They just want something that is a solution that they then can say, okay, we've now ticked the box. We have sustainable packaging, whatever that may be, and let's move on to the next thing. And I think that's the real challenge.
Right. And I think a great, again, for the three of you, sort of pointing to that sort of those multiple outcomes, sort of dependent on the choice of packaging, which kind of brings to probably the second question or second point here today. So delivering packaging functionality relates to ensuring that the packaging does what it's intended to do. Again, that ensuring food safety to start with, of course, but shelf life maximization, minimizing food loss and waste, optimizing logistics. So again, mitigating those other environmental impacts that are also important. So given this, what are you seeing as the leading challenge to deliver, if not even enhance, packaging functionality, such as shelf life and efficiency and food safety, while simultaneously reducing the packaging's environmental impact? So maybe to go backwards, Jeff, let's start with you, because again, I think you spoke to this sort of elusive balance. So what do you see as sort of the big challenge, maybe beyond how we even think about it?
So obviously there's the technical challenge of how do you design the package to get it to do what it's supposed to do and still have an end of life component. But without getting, and that's what we refer to as the packaging functionality. But taking a step back from that, I think the two biggest areas, first of all, if we're talking about retail packaging, and Dan, you've heard me say this many times before, and it's not my original quote, but 90% of the package's job is done by the time the consumer sees it. It got the food to them in a safe and healthy manner. They don't see that. What they see is something they have to get rid of in some way, shape, or form. So in many cases, consumers and even retailers don't even understand the functionality aspects of what the package does. So there's that understanding, that communication side of it. And then I think the other part's economics. It is great to say we're going to have a sustainable package, and there's a lot of technology out there that can be brought to bear around recycling, about compostability, about degradability, about reusability. But generally, those cost a little bit more. And therein lies the rub. Yes, we want to be sustainable. No, we don't want to have to pay anything more for it. So I think those overarching issues are they impact the functionality and the end of life discussion.
Yeah. Good points, Jeff. Stuart, the points that Jeff just raised, obviously, I'm sure you probably see this or hear this or live this every day. Your thoughts in terms of from where you sit, more in the primary packaging space these days, the leading challenge is to deliver on these multiple outcomes.
Well, I agree 100% with Jeff. We're seeing it, the Crawford team, we're seeing it across all avenues. And, whether somebody's looking at compostable, when you're looking at a delta 3 to 4 times, whether or not, you're looking for more sustainable and looking at, paper packaging or fiber packaging, where the delta is not as great. However, the shelf life is impacted. So there's some delicate aspects that we need to consider when we're looking at delivering the functionality. And how do you make those stars align in order to provide the consumer the best product? As JF said, you want a product the same as it was picked yesterday. So how do you bring that freshness across? And we also look at the modified atmosphere where, shelf life can be extended, which plays a big part for food waste. So there's many different aspects to delivering the package, so to speak.
Right. Thanks for that, Stuart. So JF, you being sort of, again, more behind the scenes on this, I suspect your challenges are slightly different given the role that for example, an IFCO solution plays. What are the leading challenges maybe in more of the B2B space that you're seeing these days?
I think, Dan, I think it's a great question. I would likely say that it's the what I'm going to call the fear of change, right? Well, I've always packaged my cabbage this way. I've always packaged my blueberries this way. I've always packaged my onions this way. I don't want to change because that's what I do. That's what the industry does. So when you're talking about a master container, typically there's this apprehension of, I don't want to be different than my colleagues or my peers because I need to merge, everything needs to merge at the retail location. So I would say if we're talking about in the reusable space, specifically RPCs, that's one of the largest challenges we have is in adoption is people are worried about, well, this is different from what I've been doing for a long time.
Right.
And that also reflects on the retail aspect. So from a grower perspective, they're doing something different from their peer. From a retail perspective, they also need to handle something differently. It's not throwing it in the compactor. It's not failing it. They need to stack it and wrap it and return it. So because we're talking about something different, there's a change in process. People are afraid of that.
Yeah. Very, very good point, Jeff. And again, change is always such a challenge. This kind of brings us to two questions I'd like to put to you, and we're going to kind of split it into two parts. Because a lot of the conversation around packaging relates to sort of the environmental impact that the consumers, again, I think, Jeff, you mentioned this, the consumers tend to see. It's that packaging waste piece, right? They don't appreciate what the packaging has done. They're left having to handle it. And there's obviously growing recognition that the produce industry needs sort of an array of end-of-life strategies to maybe mitigate this packaging waste piece. We do recycling, but then there's a role for reuse. There's a role maybe for compostables and so on. And then there's extended producer responsibility playing into this in terms of the fiscal pressures that's putting on the industry as well. So given all that, more sort of that front end, first half of this environmental impact question, what are your thoughts about the role mechanical recycling versus reuse versus composting and maybe even other end-of-life strategies are likely to play for the produce industry in the future? Stuart, let's start with you because I suspect you probably are playing in a little bit of all of these.
From the investment that needs to happen, Dan, I think that, when you look at the mechanical side of recycling versus end of life for a consumer, every jurisdiction around North America has different requirements. Every government, how do people recycle? How do municipalities recycle? I think there needs to be a lot more investment from a government side of it to create a clear picture for the retailer to present to the consumer. And that falls back. But we need to have the infrastructure in order to do that. And I think that with having a clear and heavier investment on the recycling stream would definitely help. And it's kind of where we see everybody wants to be green. Everybody wants to recycle. However, people put products in their blue box. Are they really going or not going to the recycling center? How much is actually being reused versus tossed in a landfill?
Yeah. And of course, this is a challenge that many other sectors face, given we all, as consumers, ultimately rely on the same blue box system to deal with our produce packaging as well as other forms of packaging. So again, it's infrastructure for that broader challenge. JF, over to you on this. What do you see as the role of recycling versus reuse versus these other end-of-life strategies? Again, on the B2B side, I suspect a different balance than what we're maybe seeing on the B2C side of things.
Yeah, good question, Dan. I believe fundamentally it comes down to value as far as when you're talking about a poly bag or a fiber box. There's very little, if any, value left after it's useful, like its use. When you're talking about a reusable, naturally I'm biased. I'm going to be biased for my industry. We have a product that is very valuable at end of life, so we want to maintain that, right? So because that product after it's done its useful trip still has so much value, there's a concentrated effort by more than one party to make sure that value is maintained in that supply chain, in that pool. So as I guess I'll leave it there. I mean, it comes down to value as far as what comes out of the product at the end of its life.
Yeah, and I think that goes to also mechanical recycling. To Stuart's point earlier, when the infrastructure is there, it maximizes the value of that commodity, that product at the end of its life, and doesn't end up not being able to tap into that value because of a lack of infrastructure, for example.
Correct, and I'll add. I mean, when we're talking about recycling in the broad scheme of things, we're talking about I'm going to say generally government run or funded capacities, which is you're relying on somebody else to figure this out for you. In the reuse model, it's really private investment, right? There's not a lot of government funding or government run agencies that will handle this stuff. So, but it also requires very similar infrastructure where you need wash plants, you need logistics, you need reverse logistics, and molds and all these things to make these programs exist. They're not as easily as plug and play as you would think either.
Right. Interesting. Jeff, given I suspect you play in a bit of everything, what do you see as sort of the role or again, given the portfolio of packaging that the produce industry relies upon, there's obviously a role for mechanical recycling in some instances, reuse in others, as JF has pointed out, maybe compostables in this instance, and maybe even other end-of-life strategies that have yet to really materialize. What do you see as the role that those might play for the industry?
Yeah, great question. And a twofold answer, if you will. And actually, I'm going to steal some of your words, Dan, because one of the challenges that we see is that people use recyclable, compostable, and reusable often interchangeably. And they are three very, very distinct technologies. And the packaging that's designed for one is not necessarily applicable for another, and vice versa. So that's the first point. Second point is, right now, technology-wise, economic-wise, fiscal-wise, all of that, there is no one ideal solution. And when you look at state legislatures or provincial or governments, everybody's looking for, just tell me what I need. Give me that solution. Well, that doesn't exist right now, and it's probably not going to exist for a while. So what we tell our clients and when we're talking and whatnot, it's going to be a myriad of solutions. You go to Japan, it's almost exclusively incineration. That's not quite as popular here in North America. There's going to be recycling. There's going to be compostability. There's going to be reuse. And depending, certainly in the B2B where JF plays, reuse can be a big technology and very advantageous. Where Stuart plays in retail, not so much. So there is no one answer. We tell our clients, keep your options open, look at everything, understand that today's solution will probably not be the solution next year and certainly not be the solution 5 years. It's an ever-changing landscape. And at this point in time, I don't think any of us can afford to say, don't do that or forget about that. I think we have to keep our options open. I know that's messy and not necessarily easy to navigate, but I don't think we have any other choice at this stage of the game.
And I would offer, Jeff, I think given the diverse, I like to jokingly say that we quintessentially live the apples, oranges, banana problem every day. And so what works for one commodity will not work for the other. And again, keeping our options open is making sure we have access to the right solutions to serve that very broad portfolio of commodities that is this industry. I'd like to then jump to the second half of this sort of environmental impact challenge question. And that one relates to the selection and the sourcing of the packaging's input materials or raw materials. There's a growing demand for renewable sources, recycled content, other alternative sources possibly. So what are you seeing as the likely innovations or developments that the industry should, keep an eye out for that will help reduce sort of this second half of the packaging's environmental footprint? Jeff, I'd like to start with you because again, I think you see this sort of macro picture. What's on your radar in terms of developments there?
Another great question and another not easy one to answer. Again, no one solution, but certainly there's a lot of new technology coming out from the fiber industry, which is potentially very exciting. One of the challenges from a functionality standpoint with the fiber is they're generally not clear. So, and in the fresh produce world, that's an issue. In the frozen food world, that's an advantage. You actually don't want to see the frozen food. But in the world we play in, people want to see the fresh produce. So there's some exciting stuff coming out in the fiber industry if you can get around the clarity side of things. There's certainly a lot of work being done in increasing post-consumer recycle content. There is exciting work with new kinds of bioresins and biofilms and whatnot. So again, we don't see one technology coming out and saying, now that we got this, we're done. We just see a lot of incremental steps. I think the thing, though, that has changed, and as you kindly alluded to, Dan, I've been doing this for a year or two. What's changed is it's now based in science. It used to be a bit of smoke and mirrors, and you could say, this is sustainable. And people go, great, that's sustainable. And they run off. And now, especially with savvy consumers and whatnot, they're saying, well, what does that mean? I want to see the science behind it. And that's probably the single biggest change I've seen. No matter what the technology is, it's based in science. And there's some data behind it, which I think is a very good thing.
Yeah. And I suspect, Jeff, that's like life cycle analysis and those sorts of methodologies that
absolutely
kind of help you understand when you claim this is a more sustainable source of material. Here's the basis for that claim. Yeah. Thanks for that, Jeff. JF, in your world, again, I suspect you rely on probably a pretty narrow source of materials, but nonetheless, this question of how to minimize that impact from material sourcing, what can you share? What are you seeing?
To your point, to your comment, Dan, I mean, we are pretty strategic and, limited as what we use. We either use virgin plastic or we use recycled RPCs. So, we cover and recycle our RPCs, throughout the globe and reuse that to make new RPCs all the time. So we are closed loop within ourselves. I've looked at post-consumer recycled or post-industrial, just because of the type of plastic that we do use in our RPCs, and we understand that is fairly hard to come by as a clean, consistent source. So that is why we tend to do a mix of RPCs and resin and virgin resin. Naturally, as everybody, Jeffrey and Jeff and Stuart have alluded to, I mean, we're always looking for new sources or new polymers that could either lightweight or provide the same functionality. It is a bit at least in the B2B world, in our reuse model, it is a little different than I'm going to see some of the challenges that my two peers here on this call have experienced or experiencing.
But nonetheless, you're doing your part is, I guess, the message here. Cool.
Yeah, we are doing our part, and that's again grinding up and reusing our PCs after they've reached their end of life, from a damage perspective, which happens, right? We know that happens, so we have a 98% recovery rate on our PCs in North America, which is pretty phenomenal when you think about it. And it comes back to value, right? We have that our PC is valuable to us because recycling our PCs is cheaper than virgin.
Yeah, cool. Stuart, I know that Crawford has a very wide array of packaging forms and hence also different materials? I suspect this is a big question for Crawford and for people like you of how to reduce this sort of environmental impact in terms of what materials you source. Is it recycled content? So what can you share in terms of that question?
Thanks, Dan. With regards to, I'll call it right sizing or right choosing, whether or not it's flow wrap or whether or not it's top seal. Top seal, we've been able to, as an industry, we've been able to reduce the amount of plastic between 25 to 30% across the board if a customer or a packer's using it. So we're seeing, there's steps forward of being more sustainable with the materials that we try to work with, try to innovate with. To Jeff's point and JF's point about reusing and picking the right product, it comes down to what is a nice to have versus what is required. And there is no right answer, from a fiber tray to, as Jeff says, to a paper tray to, being able to see the product. We also look at how do we innovate, and that's part of what we need to keep striving for is innovation on packaging and reducing. If we have a package that has a tray of product in it and we're flow wrapping it, we need to look at, can we eliminate that tray? Is there a sustainable side on that? Can we just use the film? So we try to look at different ways to provide a good consumer-friendly product that is acceptable to, the marketer, the packer, the marketer, the retailer, and eventually the consumer, because it does go through so many hands.
Yeah, lots of people to keep happy.
That's for sure.
Look, we could continue to unpack, pun intended again, this surprisingly complex and evolving world of sustainable produce packaging. So I think to close today, and again, thanks for sharing your insights. It's such a fascinating, exciting, and I think will continue to be a very challenging area of work for all of us and for our colleagues in the industry. So to close our discussion today, I'd like to ask you all a strategic question. So given the challenges of balancing these conflicting environmental, functional, social, and economic outcomes around packaging and a packaging decision, what would be the one challenge or opportunity you would prioritize for the produce industry to help increase this transition towards what we could frame or call today this functionally sustainable produce packaging? And maybe there isn't one thing, but if you kind of had to say, yeah, we got to get this piece right, what would that be? JF, I'd like to start with you on this one.
Well, me an easy one, Dan. If you're talking about one thing, ironically, one thing would be many things, insofar as there's not one solution to anything. And it's not just a consumer package. It's not just a master container. Like I said at the beginning, it's a full transit stream, right? So
it's a full system.
It's a full system. It's not one thing that makes everything work. There's many different parts to it. So it's really taking the time to understand, hey, where can I save? So maybe my consumer package, I have to have film, but then when we're talking about consumer packaging, I can have a reusable. When we're talking about my pallet, I make sure my pallet is reusable. Do I need those corner boards, or is my transit close enough that I don't need corner boards? Can I strap instead of wrapping? So there's all these different things within the entire system. So I would say the one challenge or the one opportunity would be, I would ask people to look broadly, as not just look at the one thing that the consumer sees.
So if I can paraphrase, JF, like take a systems approach to this issue. Okay, exactly. Interesting, cool. Jeff, again, I'm sure this is your day job. What's the one thing, you've given us a lot of good tidbits already, but what's that one thing that you would prioritize, given you've been doing this, as you said, for a few years now?
I think the one thing I would say is education. If there was one thing, especially in the produce world, because we have and Dan, you have heard me say this ad nauseum in a lot of public places, But we have the privilege of packaging something that's alive. It's the only food package. Generally food packaging, you keep what's in, you keep what's out, and the food product sits there. Doesn't do much. Produce is alive, consumes oxygen, gives off carbon dioxide, gives off moisture, gives off heat, responds to wounding when you slice it and dice it. All kinds of physiological things go on. And to this day, many, many people within the industry, retailers, consumers, government officials, don't understand that concept, or were not exposed to that concept. And that takes the whole functionality aspect of it to a completely different level from a packaging. So I think if we're going to really move ahead in the whole sustainability conversation and look at the entire supply chain, education of what we're actually doing in the fresh produce packaging industry has to come first. Everything else will fall from there.
Yeah, very, very interesting, Jeff. Thank you. Stuart, last word for you. You probably have 10 things you need to do, but if there's one thing from your perspective that you would prioritize, what would that thing be?
Well, I agree with Jeff on the education. It starts there for sure. With that, though, getting into a more recyclable economy from start all the way to finish, from how much PCR we include, how many days shelf life we have, how do we increase things, how do we innovate, how do we drive the right answers, the right technology to the right solution. And I think that, there's so many different ways, as Jeff said, but I definitely think that getting into a more recyclable economy is a great step forward.
Very interesting. So thanks again to our panelists, Stuart, JF, and Jeff, for joining us today and sharing their expertise and insights on sustainable produce packaging. I think our audience would agree that this conversation, although increasingly complex, is moving in a direction that will ensure that we better balance the packaging that we have as an industry to sort of meet these multiple priorities. Thanks again to our valued sponsor, Crawford Packaging, for making today's recording possible. This concludes our Fall 2025 Sustainability Series, and if you've not had the opportunity yet, I invite you to listen to our 2 recent episodes, Sustainability, A Lifelong Journey, featuring Justine Taylor, Chief Sustainability Officer at Topline Farms, and From Burden to Advantage, Rethinking Sustainability Reporting and Assurance, featuring experts from Taylor Farms, the Potato Sustainability Alliance, and Fresh Endeavors Consulting. We also invite you to check out the other CPMA Produce Talk podcasts wherever you get your favorite podcasts. To close today, we'll be back in the late spring of 2026 with a new sustainability series, so we hope to see you then. Until then, take care, and thanks for spending time with us today.
Thank you to our guests and to you, our listeners, for joining us. Be sure to subscribe to Produce Talks on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast app so you never miss an episode. Until next time, fill half your plate with fruits and veggies, keep seeking new knowledge, and never stop growing.